Adventure Time is my favorite show of all time. I always keep thinking that there's other shows, but when people ask me what my favorite show is, I always say Adventure Time. It's a show that I have watched since it first aired in 2010, and dropped off a little bit towards like the 2015 era, but returned to when it was announced that it was going to be ending, and binged the whole show, and was blown away by how much the show had progressed and aged as I had. Not many shows last for as long as Adventure Time does, and not many shows expand upon how long it lasts by slowly evolving both the characters and the maturity of the storyline. Adventure Time provides a playground for interesting stories. My favorite episodes of Adventure Time are the small standoff anthology-like episodes where they just go and explore a certain part of Ooh. So I was really glad that HBO picked up Adventure Time after its Cartoon Network finale and has released both Distant Lands and the most recent Fionna and Cake. Now, today's going to be a bit interesting because I'm going to do kind of a full recap review of Fionna and Cake, but I want to do it within the context of Ice King, one of the characters that has been in Adventure Time from the very beginning, because I was surprised by how much Ice King is integral to the Fionna and Cake storyline. So why don't we just jump back, we'll do an intro to Ice King, and look at why I think he is the most important and also the most tragic character in the entirety of Adventure Time. Ice King is introduced as one of the main antagonists of the show. He is shown as this pathetic but still very lovable villain who's kind of a little bit naive. There's something wrong with Ice King in his brain. We think that there might be some sort of madness that is caused by his power. But for the most part, his characterization isn't that far developed. He's funny, he's weird, and he's wacky. He's a good cartoon villain. However, as the episodes progress, we eventually get Holly Jolly's secrets, which gives us some backstory as to who Ice King was before he was Ice King. He was Simon Petrikov, a scientist, more specifically an antiquarian. I had to look that up. That's why there was a weird cut. It's because I didn't know what an antiquarian was, and I couldn't remember what it was called. It's antique studying. He studies like antiques. I'm going to see if I can remember that before having to go like, antiquarian. So he's an antiquarian, and eventually he finds this crown that he puts on and slowly starts to, the crown starts to corrupt him. So that's interesting, right? Ice King is actually, at his core, this normal antiquarian, but has been corrupted by the power of the crown. Now, eventually, this crown becomes an integral part of the Adventure Time storytelling mythos. It becomes this kind of key item that happens in magic item that eventually is used multiple times throughout the season, which we will get to. But part of what makes Ice King's character even more tragic is the now famous episode, I Remember You, where he and Marceline the Vampire Queen have a moment where she reveals to him that he is the person who helped her during the Mushroom War, basically, during the aftermath of the Mushroom War, when there were zombies kind of going around everywhere. Simon Petrikov, still not fully encapsulated by the crown, helps Marceline survive, basically, and acts as a kind of father figure to her. However, in order to do that, and to protect her, he has to put the crown on more and more, which starts to corrupt him faster and faster, until a point where he no longer remembers that. He has been fully corrupted by the crown, and he leaves Marceline. This is an incredibly interesting and tragic storyline that is just like attached to one of the weirdest and wackiest villains in cartoons. Like, the fact that Adventure Time even has like the goal to do this is incredible. So throughout the rest of Adventure Time, we have this constant knowledge now that Ice King is not necessarily mad, but in fact is someone who was corrupted by power. This then further goes into Ice King's narrative. He actually had a fiance before he went mad. That fiance he used to call his princess. That's part of why he has this obsession with capturing princesses. So all of this is connected to Ice King's story. They say your story is only ever as good as your villain, and Adventure Time's villain is the epitome of good writing villains. It's someone who we understand completely. He is not someone that we root for because we don't like them. He is definitely someone who does bad things. But by providing reasons as to why we feel for Ice King, we sympathize for him. This eventually leads up to the finale of Adventure Time, and in that last episode, Betty, Simon's fiance, comes back and eventually sacrifices herself to rid Simon of this curse. The Adventure Time finale does a great job of closing a bunch of character arcs while still leaving a lot of them open and interesting. It doesn't just say, show's done, this is the end of the show, but does a good job of finally giving catharsis to a lot of what has happened over the past 10 or 11 seasons. I would say that all of the characters get a happy ending except for Simon. Simon ends the show in tears as Betty, his fiancée, the only person he's ever loved, disappears and is eaten by Golb, and how he is left iceless, powerless, just as a person. This is a tragic ending for Ice King. As it says, a tragic characterization has a tragic ending. He doesn't get a redemption arc. He's just sad because the one thing that he wanted more than anything else sacrificed herself so that he could now live a normal life. But was it worth it? Well, This then goes into Adventure Time Distant Lands. Now, Distant Lands is a kind of sequel/prequel show that has a lot of like small anthology episodes about the Adventure Time universe. Some of them are continuations, some of them aren't. One of them shows Finn and Jake's life after the finale. Some of them shows Marceline and Bubblegum's life afterwards. Some of them shows like Peppermint Butler stuff. Simon Petrikov only appears in one of these episodes, the one with Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, where he is singing a kind of a cappella version of I Remember You in a bar in the Candy Kingdom. He is still Simon at this point and has been kind of gone back to his normal standard state. So this is where Simon is at the beginning of the Fionna and Cake show. Now, when I heard that Fionna and Cake was being announced, I thought it was going to be like a fun spin-off episode that had nothing to do with the traditional original Adventure Time timeline. It was just this other multiversal thing where they were able to do a lot of the same stories as Adventure Time, but weren't confined to the restrictions of OO that they have set up over the past 11 seasons. I thought they were basically just going to do a hard reset. I was wrong. This show is a sequel to Adventure Time, very, very much. Like, I was surprised at how much the show just goes, yeah, if you weren't aware of what happened in Adventure Time, you gotta have to catch up. And I think that it still does a good job of introducing the new plot lines, but this whole season is Adventure Time season 12. Like, absolutely. It's fully continuation. And this continuation hinges on Simon Petrikov. He is the star of Fionna and Cake. Fionna and Cake originally were understood as fan fiction characters created by Ice King to kind of have this fun other world that he like writes fanfiction about Finn and Jake. It's a fun little thing. But again, Adventure Time, classic, turns this fun joke into incredibly compelling narrative. So what is that narrative? Okay, now this is Adventure Time, Fionna and Cake. So we start with episode 1. I just said that Ice King is integral to the show. He does not appear at all in episode 1. Episode 1 starts off in a world that's kind of similar to like our world. It's like a real world type thing where there's this person called Fionna Campbell and she hates her job. The opening credits to this episode are amazing. It's just like this whole idea of I'm a young person and I don't want to do any work, but whatever, I have to do work because I have to do work. It's this really fun, like, look at, it's like the complete antithesis to what Adventure Time is. Me, and I'm sure many other people, would have opened the show and expected an Adventure Time type story, and instead got this really well written, really, really interesting real life allegory for like what it is like to be a dreamer. It opens with this beautifully animated Sailor Moon-esque type dream sequence where Fionna sees this Winter King guy and is like, wow, and then wakes up and it turns out all of that was a dream. So it opens with this, oh, this is what we want from Fionna and Cake. The art style looks really cool. There's obviously a lot of like anime and Ghibli inspired type imagery, but it hard cuts to just boring, colorless world that Fionna Campbell lives in. Now, that being said, I loved this episode. The development of Fiona's character is awesome, and like the way in which Cake is just a cat, and we have all of these kind of hints at Adventure Time characters. There is an appearance of Marshall Lee and Gary Prince, as he is called in this world, and the Banana Guards, and Starchy, and all of these other characters that we recognize as fans of Adventure Time. But obviously, we go, why are they people? Why are they just normal people in this world? Why aren't they the kind of characters that we know? And I think this does a really good job of hooking the viewer in, because immediately we go, hang on, this isn't what I expected. It's a very bold move to make from a first episode, but I think Adventure Time has kind of established itself as having this incredible like ability to write incredibly engaging stories. And in this case, I was engaged, and I was like, I trust the team. I trust the writing team of Adventure Time to know what is going on, and to know that wherever we're going to go, it's going to be great. And so the episode kind of ends with Cake, who has been sick this whole time, running around and eventually jumping into an ice cream truck and disappearing. Fionna and Cake episodes released 2 at a time, and I think that was a great idea because the second episode you really would want to watch after the first one, and it ends up being the kind of polar opposite of the show. This episode proves why Simon is the core of the show. It again opens with him just like in a room, and immediately I was like, oh, is this set before the Great Mushroom War? Maybe Fionna and Cake were real people that Simon knew before he the Mushroom War happened and everyone died. But actually, what happens is that the walls to Simon's apartment open up, and it turns out that he is like a living zoo basically, and he has to sit there and be like, this is what life was like in the 21st century. I'm an antiquarian. And it's this, and everyone from the human world comes and watches him and sees the history of their own people. And he's miserable. He hates it because everyone else wants to ask him about Fionna and Cake. Or this one kind of adoring fan who comes in and goes, hey, you are Ice King, right? You wrote one of my favorite books ever. And he goes, I'm not Ice King anymore. I'm just I'm Simon Petrikov, I'm an antiquarian, this is what I do. He has left the Ice King behind him. He can't engage with that part of him anymore. He goes to a bar and kind of drinks his sorrows away because in reality, what it turns out is that Simon Short no longer has his powers and is afflicted by the curse. But without Betty, he doesn't have any other reason to live. He has this tragic, he lives between two worlds. He doesn't have the power of the Ice King, but he doesn't have his one true love. So instead he has to sit knowing that she sacrificed herself so that he can live this life, but what kind of a life is he living? He has this conversation with Finn at the bar, an older, now kind of stronger Finn, who takes him on an adventure, and they go into the forest and they fight these monsters, so that Finn tries to give Simon another reason to live. This is a really great characterization because this is how Finn understands life. All he is he's an adventurer and he's a hero. He's a problem solver. And so for him, his life revolves around destroying monsters and stuff like that. And for him to kind of struggle to relate to Simon is this really beautiful character moment where Finn and Simon are sitting around the fire and he goes, so is this like helping you? And Simon's like, well, I don't know. But eventually Simon comes back to his antiquarian zoo life, and we find out that he has captured Shoes Goose and is using him to siphon power to try and resurrect Betty. In doing this, however, he somehow opens a portal out of the back of his head, and out comes Cake the cat. The same cat that just ran into the icebox in the last episode. So now we have this at least understanding that Fionna and Cake's world, this boring world, exists within the mind of Simon Petrikov. And that's how the episode ends. It goes bang, whoops, there you go, there's Cake the cat. Wow. So episode 3, Simon is now kind of confused as to why Cake's there, but Cake runs away, and eventually Simon kind of freaks out and goes, uh-oh, well, I've done something wrong here. Prismo is notified via a little thing on his remote that there is some sort of problem within the multiverse. Cake eventually gets the ability to talk by giving like a kind of neck thing that gives them powers, and then runs about Ooh and finds out more about Ooh. Now, while this is happening, Fionna in Simon's mind world is looking for Cake, can't find Cake, but eventually finds the way to get into Ooh. So she kind of eventually figures out a way to get transported into the Ooh world, and now she and Cake are both in Ooh. They've both gotten out of Simon's mind. I like the way that when Fionna gets into Ooh, she finds out that she and Cake have like these badass hero abilities, and like they can like, you know, take names and fight people, and they just kind of like wreck. And it's awesome because it's almost like this idea that they were always destined to do this, but obviously have been confined to whatever world that they're living in, but now can grab sticks and whack things and break talking cups and stuff like that. I find it really fun the way that Adventure Time kind of eats into this idea of archetypes and yet still very easily undermines them. Fionna and Cake are archetypal characterizations of Finn and Jake. Finn and Jake being like the quintessential hero. However, in this case, it's more like what happens when the hero has not heroed for a while. These are heroes who never knew their ability to be a hero and now exist in a world where that is possible. This episode felt very quintessentially Adventure Time to me. It's that kind of like fun forest animal creatures fighting, and then also like funny, wacky joke things. So this was very Adventure Time for an episode for me, and I really, really enjoyed it. But while they're fighting and realizing their true potential, eventually they get snapped out of it, and they realize that, oh, hang on, they've been transported somewhere else. Now, where have they gone? Well, that's the main question for the next episode. So this episode opens with Prismo. Now, Sean Rahani is no Nanjiani, but he's doing a very good job at imitating Kumail's performance, and that goes for everyone in the show. There are some kind of cast changes that happens during this show, and I think everyone has done an incredible job of evoking the original voice without, like, just doing the same thing and still giving it their own. So shout out to Sean Rahani for doing an incredible job at kind of taking up the mantle of Prismo. In this episode, it is revealed that Fionna and Cake was not a creation of the Ice King, but in fact a creation of Prismo, who while bored created a new universe that was literally just the same as Ooh, but kind of like swapped around. And because he's not allowed to do that, he put it into the one mind in Ooh that is the most crazed and the most guarded, which is Ice King's, which is very interesting. Right now, again, Adventure Time has kind of retconned their own storytelling, but in a way that doesn't undermine the original story. Ice King, of course, always has this idea of Fionna and Cake, but in this case, we understand that it has now been implanted by Prismo, and it's not just an idea, but in fact an entire multiverse. However, when Ice King became normal, when Betty sacrificed herself to remove the ice powers from Ice King, he just became a normal man, and as a result, his mind stopped being this kind of like crown corrupted mind and instead just became the mind of a normal man. And as a result, the multiverse inside of his head also became just a normal universe. This also now introduces the main antagonist of this show, which is another god who is trying to he's kind of like a god cop who is trying to capture Prismo because he's done this bad thing, right? You can't create multiverses. And so eventually this guy shows up and Prismo's like, uh-oh, I need to get rid of you guys. You have created a kind of multiversal error that I'm going to get in trouble for. So he pushes them out and they run about Prismo's lair. Again, great world design building from Adventure Time. It's such a wonderful set of stairs, this kind of MC Escher type rooms that they run through. And eventually they end up escaping from Prismo's lair with the remote that is used to travel through through the multiverse. Now, this is the beginning of what I kind of expected the show to be, this kind of multiverse hopping fun anthology type storytelling, but I'm really glad that instead what the writers did was kind of use this as a device to explore the characterizations of both Fionna and Cake and also Simon Petrikov. So at the end of this episode, they get transported to this farm world type thing and realize that they have to try and find a crown so that Ice King can go mad again and that Fionna and Cake can go back and their world can go back to the way it was. Now, there are many other multiverses that we have seen throughout the original Adventure Time, and in some of those, the crown is important. In probably the most famous one, the Finn the Human and Jake the Dog episodes, Finn gets the crown. He has this long nose and becomes this kind of corrupted king. And there are other multiverses with other crowns, and basically what Fionna and Cake and Simon realize is that they have to travel throughout the multiverse and find a crown that they can put on Simon's head. So episode 5 starts and they're in this universe that's very similar to a Mad Maxi type thing, where it's leather chains and cars and there's rival gangs, and the gangs are all about wheels and tires and stuff. While here they also find out that this is the universe that Finn was corrupted in the Finn the Human episode. This is Farm World Finn's world, where he eventually became the crazy Iceman, but eventually always has given up his power. I also love that Adventure Time has this now ongoing gag where Finn is destined to lose his arm in every universe. So obviously this Finn has a kind of claw arm type thing, and it's also this fun robot thing where it turns into a soup ladle and a claw and stuff like that. There was something about this episode where obviously all of the characters are humanoid that reminded me of regular show a lot, especially this character. This character in particular just gave me such regular show vibes. And this whole episode was very regular show for me. I don't really know why. Maybe it was that kind of type of masculine humor that I still enjoyed, but was I was oh wow, this is really regular show-y, which I thought was very funny for a show that obviously is of a similar time to regular show. But we also then find Shoes Goose in this world as well. There are characters that remind us of Adventure Time characters. I love the way in which Adventure Time has done such a great job, obviously in terms of cartoon character design. They say if you can recognize a silhouette, then you can see a character, and it's good character design. In Adventure Time's case, there's a level above that where each character has a certain trait and a certain voice and a certain look that can translate not just through silhouette but also through just vibes. We understand characters, especially in the first episode of the show, where we see characters that we go, that's the Banana Gods, that's Starchy, that's meant to be Ice King, because of how they're characterized, how they're dressed, how they talk. The context in which we see them is very similar to the context in which we see the original characters through Adventure Time. And I really like how this episode again has those kind of little nods to these, almost as if they're destined character archetypes that exist throughout the entirety of the multiverse. But in the end, no luck, they don't find a crown, and instead they have to move to the next world. The next world is a winter type themed land, and the kind of king of this land is a guy called the Winter King, and he's very similar to the Winter King that Fionna saw in the original dream in the first episode, that kind of Sailor Moon type Winter King man. I was watching this episode and I was like, oh, I really like this, the style is really good, and then the Winter King bursts into song, and I was watching and I was like, oh, that kind of sounds like BDG, and I was like, hang on, is that BDG? Is that Brian David Gilbert? And the more I listened to it, the more I was like, oh my god, that's Brian David Gilbert. And I was like, this is great. Congrats, BDG, on being in Adventure Time. That's awesome. Brian David Gilbert is perfect for this show, and perfect for this specific character as this kind of fun, wacky singing Iceman. So Brian David Gilbert casting in this specific episode, incredible casting. Very, very well done. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. I was not expecting this at all.
I'm just playing, ladies. You know I love you.
This episode also has a kind of B storyline back in the original Simon's Mind world with Gary Prince and Marshall Lee, who have this moment where they kind of connect, where Marshall likes the gingerbread man that Gary makes and wants to kind of see him succeed. Again, there's this kind of, obviously we as Adventure Time fans understand the relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, and it makes us also go, well, maybe there are other things that are destined within every world. Maybe the relationship between these two characters is always meant to happen. They're always meant to kind of fall in love with each other. That B plot kind of looks at the destined relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, and that kind of gets then paralleled alongside this world of the Winter King's world, where the Winter King actually turns out he's a really cool guy. He's this fun Ice King who isn't like confined by the madness of the crown, but still has all the powers of it. But it turns out that in this world, while the Winter King is normal, Princess Bubblegum has kind of like gone and become corrupted in some way. She is this kind of like witch, quote unquote, type who has this kind of cackling laugh, and she's the one who wants to capture the Winter King. And so eventually both Simon and the Winter King gets captured by this Princess Bubblegum type and are like going to go into like this blender that's going to kill them, and then Fionna and Cake have to save the day. There's this really great moment where towards like the end of the episode, Gary Prince in Simon's real world, and it's kind of explaining how, like, in that world, the Candy Kingdom has become this kind of themed bakery that Gary wants to make, which is a great idea. And I really love the idea that, like, Cinnamon Bun and the Banana Gods and Starchy and all that are characters within the world of his bakery. And then they juxtapose that by showing their versions in the Winter King world as they kind of get slain by Fionna and Cake. It's this really fun, like, match cut that I thought was very, very clever and well written for the show. But Adventure Time has done such a great job of putting these two storylines together, one that is a lot more grounded and one that is obviously within this fun, wacky world. And I think the way this episode kind of jumps back and forth between the A and B storylines really kind of hammers home the fact that there is still fun in the real world, and there's still there's still like a grounding of reality in the zany Winter King world. Because as it turns out, what happens is the Winter King is not this great fun guy, but has instead corrupted the Princess Bubblegum, and she is now the one who has been corrupted by the crown because he has kind of forced it upon her. Turns out Winter King, not such a great guy either. Fionna, of course, during this episode kind of starts like flirting with the Winter King, and she kind of likes him. Turns out he's not a good guy at all. Again, characterization is the core of what makes Adventure Time. I feel like after talking about the Superman episode as well, I'm a sucker for good character writing, and I think Adventure Time does this in spades. These archetypes also then show up again in this episode in the way that Princess Bubblegum fills the archetype of the villain, right? She is now what we understand as the traditional Ice King, and the Winter Prince is now what we understand as the traditional Princess Bubblegum. The relationship between Finn and the Winter King kind of echoes the relationship between Finn the human and Princess Bubblegum. The relationship between Bubblegum and Ice King is kind of inverted. The way in which Fionna and Cake takes these kind of established characters that we know and we understand from Adventure Time and flips them, plays with them, and uses them to create more interesting stories is really quite incredible. And I really love the way in which the show kind of understands that the people who are watching have a basic understanding of what Adventure Time is and who the characters are, and as a result can then twist those and play with those and use those as devices throughout this entire season. If you thought episode 6 kind of furthers the relationship between Marcy and Bubblegum, this episode, I think, very specifically is the two parallels between the two different types of relationships that we have expected from these Marceline and Bubblegum-esque characterizations. So in the Fionna and Cake world, they travel to this dimension that's like being haunted by vampires, and the idea is that like if Simon hadn't found Marceline, she would have become a vampire-like person who... and she would never have hunted the vampires. This whole episode is a very big reference to the Stakes miniseries, which is a great kind of miniseries that Adventure Time did back in the original run. So in this world, Bonnabelle is this like eye patch wearing military person who has a Peppermint Butler AI, which is really cool. It's like a tank that has like Peppermint Butler AI things, and just like suits it really, really well. They have a fight of Marceline, who's like the vampire queen, and then obviously the main vampire king who has the crown, so they want to get the crown off of him. And meanwhile, in the Inside Simon, the Fionna and Cake world, Gary and Marshall Lee end up going to this dinner where Gary explains his ideas and he gets really well, but turns out that Marshall Lee sacrificed for Gary and basically wants to put him, now he's like saying, well, now I have to join my mother even though I didn't want to, and Gary sees that, and eventually they escape together. But this episode is really interesting in how it shows, again, these kind of destined character dynamics and archetypes that exist throughout all of the multiverse. In this case, specifically the relationship between Marceline and Princess Bubblegum. And especially in this episode, especially like within the Stakes universe, the idea that Simon was a force for good. He helped Marceline. He corrected Marceline's path. He pushed her in a direction that was, in the end, a good one, which kind of calls back to the second episode where he reaches out to Marceline because he feels very lonely and she doesn't really have much time for him because she's off with Princess Bubblegum. And so there is this kind of tragedy and father-like figures of, I raised this person, and now they obviously they don't have time for me anymore. But this episode specifically kind of, it reminds the audience that, you know what, Simon actually did do a really good thing here. What he did was help Marceline and correct her path, and maybe that's something that that deserves praise and happiness and contentness in your life. This whole series then, it hinges on the fact that it's about reminding Simon about who he is and why he is the person that he is, and finding himself. Basically, that's what this whole season is about, which is wild to think that is the core of Fionna and Cake, is about Ice King finding out who he is really. Incredible storytelling. Episode 8, they go to another dimension that's like barren, and they find BMO. Hell yeah, love BMO, more BMO, and it's great. And BMO like ends up kind of being all of the people in this universe, because BMO puts on a princess crown and becomes Princess Bubblegum and loves to act. And so as they all travel together, BMO specifically ends up being the kind of like NPC. It kind of reads like a Dungeons and Dragons type adventure where BMO is the DM and goes around and plays all of the NPCs in this world. And as they're walking, BMO's like, oh, that's Jerry lives in there. Jerry's down in that whole place. And everyone's like, oh, I don't know who Jerry is. It's classic like Adventure Time type. Oh, this is a fun little fact. This episode, we also get a lot of flashbacks into Simon's past, his relationship with Betty, as Simon kind of tells Fionna about who Betty was and how they met and all of those things. And we get a little bit more backstory into Simon's personality and why he loves Betty so much, and their relationship, which we have only really gotten hints at throughout the entirety of Adventure Time. Of course, Betty now having fused with Golb, there is this kind of interesting dynamic between the two of them, and to give it like a kind of a serious flashback episodes to show the real heart at what this core relationship is, and this kind of burgeoning romance between Simon and Betty is quite beautiful. But at the end of this episode, eventually the crew in the multiverse, in BMO's Forgotten World, go and visit Jerry. And it turns out that Jerry is the Lich. And this is one of the most... I love the Lich as a character. It's incredible. There's that now infamous kind of design documentation that was found from all of Adventure Time to be like, the Lich is not funny. Any interaction that Finn and Jake have with the Lich should be taken extremely seriously. The Lich can destroy anything. Like, it's the pure embodiment of death and destruction and chaos. And so in this specific case, the Lich acts as this kind of like connection to Golb and to the new world. So at the end of the episode, Simon realizes that he can kind of harness the Lich's power and use the crown to put Fionna and Cake back into his head. However, as they do that, something goes wrong, and they blink out of existence. So episode 9 opens. Fionna and Cake have gone back into their reality, back into Simon's head, but the world has no magic in it. It's the same boring world, the same one that happened when Simon converted away from the Ice King. Meanwhile, Simon and the Lich have this moment in kind of multidimensional space and interact with Golb for the first time, or Golb Betty, as they are now, as Simon kind of gets tested by Golb Betty, and his consciousness is put into the brain of Shami. Shami and Beth, of course, from the finale of Adventure Time, these two people who exist in this kind of post long distance future of Ooh. And so Simon ends up kind of getting embroiled in their conflict while talking with the other inhabitants of the world. Fionna and Cake don't really know what will happen to them if this world suddenly turns back into the kind of off-brand Ooh. Will Marshall Lee and Gary, will they cease to exist? What happens to them now? And so Fionna has this kind of existential crisis, realizing, oh, hang on, what happens to the people who I deeply care for? Are they just going to disappear? What matters more to me, my ability to be cool and have fun magic powers, or the relationships of the friends that I have? And so this whole episode kind of brings into the focus, the core of the show, which is the relationship dynamic between first Betty and Simon, and then Fionna and her friends. And Cheers, of course, has become like this now running gag in Adventure Time, especially in specifically in relation to Simon Petrikov's story. The idea that Cheers is used as this kind of like emotional through line throughout most of Adventure Time is incredibly intriguing. And especially in this episode, Cheers is used as this kind of throwaway line of what would the people in Cheers do? Because Cheers is a show about friends. It's a show about interactions between people and the importance of those social interactions. And this episode is very much about that as well. But the episode ends with the Scarab inserting himself into Simon's head and then invading the Fionna and Cake world. And so in the final episode, the Scarab is now invading the Fionna and Cake world, and the time is now of the essence as they try to quickly have to figure out how they have to save the world and stop the Scarab Man from erasing them from existence. And the whole time, Fiona's like, if only we had magic. If we had magic, we could save the world. And that's kind of her main conflict. Meanwhile, Simon's conflict is realizing that through a kind of choose your own adventure, finds out that every choice that he made was very serviced himself more than anyone else, and it made him kind of recontextualize his relationship with Betty. How much of their relationship was him putting her aside for his own personal gain, which eventually led to him finding the Enchiridion and then getting trapped and eventually becoming Ice King. And so both of these eventually culminate in the two characters coming to terms with themselves and realizing, Fionna realizes that turns out there is magic in the world as it is, and there doesn't need to be magic innate. It could just, this is our world. Maybe we can live for the world that we have rather than the one that we want. And Simon realizes that the sacrifice that Betty made for him is not the first one. Betty has been sacrificing herself for him forever, and in fact, instead of being upset at Betty at this sacrifice, maybe understanding and coming to terms with the fact that the sacrifices that she made for him shows how much he truly cares, and he understands her a little bit better. And so eventually he snaps out of his trance, gets removed from the body of Shami, and then Fionna calls him and asks, hey, we need some help here. Do you want to put on... and he goes, it's okay, I'll put on the crown. And she goes, no, don't do that. We don't want to become Magic World anymore. We want to be as we are. We want to save this world rather than making a new one. Rather than running away from our problems, we want to embrace them. Simon does the same thing. So eventually he coughs out Fiona's original world, puts it back in, and then their world is kind of imbued with the magic of the Fionna and Cake world, which ends up canonizing it. Now, the way in which this episode kind of deals with canonization on like a meta level is really interesting, because obviously Fionna and Cake from the beginning were fan fiction of Adventure Time, and there were episodes in the original series where there was reference to, maybe it's real, maybe this person is Fionna in real life, but in fact it's not. But this specifically canonizes the Fionna and Cake universe within the context of the wider Adventure Time world, which is extremely interesting because now the setup that this season has done is now incorporated them both together. There is this connection now between this world that we have kind of created over the past 10 episodes and the other Adventure Time world that we know and we are kind of more familiar with. So in the end, the world is saved, both Fionna and Cake's world and Simon returns to the world that he lives in, and Fionna and Cake live happily ever after. Cake, of course, still being a magical cat in this normal world. But Simon, of course, has gone through this whole season having this characterization, this journey from being someone who is selfish and depressed primarily, to now someone who is able to come to terms with the sacrifice that his love made for him. And instead of wallowing in her sacrifice, accepting it and understanding that to waste that sacrifice is worse than to try and understand why. And so he kind of breaches out of his shell. He starts talking to Finn's mom for therapy. He starts to teach the girl who liked his stuff from Fionna and Cake. And so eventually the season concludes very kind of conclusively, which I like, but obviously this is Adventure Time and I want more of it, and I'm sure that they will be able to make more of it. But to think that the journey of this, if you were to give this kind of pitch for a story of Simon Petrikov to me, when I watched Adventure Time for the first time, or even within the first 3 seasons, I would have thought, what? No way. There's no way that Ice King can have this kind of a character journey within a 10 episode period. But now here we are, however, 13 years later, and the core of this show is the exploration of a deeply flawed and tragic character who began his journey as this wacky, villainous cartoon character and has now become a fully realized and interesting exploration of human grief. That's not something that I would expect from Adventure Time at the start, but it's now something that Adventure Time has kind of prided themselves on becoming. Adventure Time Fionna and Cake is a show about Simon Petrikov, and more specifically, the way Ice King deals with the death of his lover. And I gotta say, it's just as interesting a journey. I happily turned off all my stuff and I didn't record an outro. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you watching this video. I hope that they make more of the show. I really liked it. I think we've had a pretty great era of animated character-driven entertainment at the moment. But yeah, thank you for watching. If you liked this video, let me know. Who's your favorite like niche Adventure Time character? Maybe I could do like a smaller deep dive on that. I'm a big fan. My favorite episode is the clown face one, where Jake's foot ends up being a clown. And this is like a 10-minute look at that. I think it's a silent episode as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.